Well, I'm slightly worried that I'm about to give the boring talk, and I thought that this was going to be a meeting about statistics, and I thought, well, I'd better write down a couple of equations or something like that. And I'm even more worried that I've got one or two equations and there haven't been any others yet. And so I'm going to try and talk about something which is slightly more technical and slightly more narrow, I think, than many people have talked about so far. And so I hope you'll bear with me. I've been thinking about league tables for quite a few years now, and those of you who are associated with the university will probably know that there's quite an emphasis on league tables and the university's position in league tables, and it really does make a huge amount of difference to how the university is regarded. And what these league tables do, not just league tables about the university, but what they do is they take a large number of statistics, maybe 8 or 9, something like that is typical, a large number of key performance indicators in some management speak, and they summarize them into one score, and then based on the score that you've got, you're ranked. And so somebody comes out top of the league table and somebody comes out bottom of the league table, and your position in the league table can make a huge difference. And so what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit of work that we've been doing to try and flesh out the league table, to have a look at the several criteria which go into any particular league table. And so just a couple of methods for trying to understand them. So I think what these league tables try to do, as I've set up here, is they try to combine a number of criteria into a single score, which is then used to produce a ranking. And the sort of example I'm going to talk about a bit is this one, which is the Combined Universities Guide, where there are these 9 criteria: student satisfaction, research, staff-student ratio, how much money you spend in various places, what your entry standards are, interestingly, how many people complete the course, and what their prospects are after they leave the university. And most of these, particularly in this league table, they're all weighted. They have a weight 1, but a couple of them, student satisfaction and research quality, they get a bit of extra weight. And so you might start to worry about these, how this league table is constructed. And briefly, one of the worries, or first worry, is that these criteria are measured in different scales, different units even. And so some of them are proportions, several of them are proportions, but some of them are just pounds, how much money you spend. So how, of course, do you combine those? And then they're measured in different scales which are unbounded, some scales which are between 0 and 1, and so on. And the usual response in constructing a league table is to normalize all of the data by each one of the criteria individually by probably subtracting the mean and dividing by the standard deviation to get a z-score, and then doing something with the z-score, which is usually just weighting them by these weights here, which I'm going to call gamma k, and adding the result up, and that gives you a score, which is then used for ranking. I'm not very happy with that. I don't really like the conversion to z-scores to start off with. I mean, it's obviously better than nothing, but I think that very seldom are the data normally distributed, and so converting to a z-score is probably not the right thing to do. And so I'm not quite sure how we should meaningfully assign these weights. And I'd like to be able to sort of understand the structure of the data a bit better. And I'm going to show you some rather boring visualizations compared with some of the ones that we've seen so far. But I think that the last talk made it clear that people if you present the data to them nicely, then they're able to have a look at it and investigate it themselves. And so if you're choosing your university, you might look into the data a bit more closely. One of the other things that I do is think about multi-objective optimization. And very often you want to optimize more than one thing. And so here I've got 2 objectives. Just the first one here, and you'd like to be as good as you can on this objective and as good as you can also on this second objective here. And And so people talk about these, if I think about these 3 points here, the red one is wholly better than the blue one because it's better both on the first objective and on the second objective. But that's not the case for the red and the green one. Here the red one is better on the second objective but worse on the first objective. And so whereas you might say that the red point dominates the blue point because it's wholly better on both of the objectives, then the red and the green ones are what's called mutually non-dominating. And so, and likewise, this blue and the green one, they are also mutually non-dominating. And so that means, if you've got a couple of things which on 2 criteria are mutually non-dominating, you've got a bit of a problem because it's a bit difficult to decide which one is best. And that's the problem that league tables are trying to solve. And what I'd like to do is step back a little bit from that and see whether we can look at what are, for example, the mutually non-dominating universities. So there's a technique that comes from multi-objective optimization. And suppose that instead of just those 3 points, I've got a whole lot of points here. Each one of these might, for example, represent a university, just evaluated on these 2 objectives. And so the first thing I could do would be to look for the Pareto optimal universities, the ones which are Pareto efficient, and they're the ones which are mutually non-dominating, but they're also not dominated by any other university. And so I might be able to identify these red ones up here. And actually I'd point out that all I really need to know is the ranks of the universities. All I have to do is compare them. It's just whether one is better or worse than another on a particular criterion. I don't actually have to know qualitatively or quantitatively how much better they are. It's just whether one is better or worse than the other one. Okay, so once I've found this Pareto front, this what I'm going to call the first Pareto shell, then I could delete all of those temporarily from my data, leaving this, and then I could look for the second Pareto shell, and here they are. This lot are now the ones which are not dominated by any of the remaining ones. And I could keep on doing that to eventually reveal one Pareto shell after another Pareto shell. So as an example of that, rather than talk directly about the universities, of which there are quite a lot of them, I thought I'd show you these data, which come from David Nutt's group. And you may remember a couple of years ago, he made quite a stir by evaluating drug harm, which he essentially combined using weights into a league table of the harm that various drugs do. There are 20 drugs, which I'll show you on the next slide, and these are the various criteria against which he assessed them. So I've done that sort of Pareto sorting that I've just talked about, and here's the result of it. And I hope you can read that, but all of that here. What I've drawn is, here's the first shell. So these drugs are optimal at doing harm. All right, so I'm afraid I've inverted in a rather perverse way. These drugs' jobs is to be as harmful as possible. Okay, so if you're in the first Pareto shell up here, then you are the most harmful ones. And so up at the top here is crack, alcohol, and heroin. So in some sense, each of those is, you can't decide which one of them is worse than the others on this basis, but they're all worse than all of these in shell 2. So we've got methadone, cannabis, cat, I'm not quite sure what that is, mushrooms actually, ketamine, LSD, and so on. Cocaine's down here. And then you see this structure which goes down to the end here to drugs which I'm pleased to say I haven't heard of on the bottom. It's not quite right because there are also a few, there are 3 up here. Oh, sorry, I should have said that these arrows, they tell you which other drugs in the shell below dominate. And so here heroin dominates methadone and cannabis, and crack, lots of things. All of these things, cat down to the bottom here, are dominated by crack cocaine. Not quite right, because I've got up here these things which look as though they might be a bit weak, actually. Tobacco, GHB, and butane. Butane, I think, is a relatively drug which is not terribly harmful, but on some scores it is harmful, and that gets it right up into this Pareto optimal shell. And so one thing I could inquire is how robust are each of these drugs in the shell that they live in? And one way of assessing that is by the number of, if I've got 5 extra ranks and I could distribute it amongst the criteria, which of the, by distributing them, which of the drugs would be demoted to the shell below. And so here, this colour bar represents how robust in each shell those drugs are. And so again, here, crack right at the top appears to be most firmly dominant in that shell. So this is what we call demotion stability. So here's an equation, and I'll be quick about this. We wanted something better to do than just this sort of graphical analysis here. We really wanted to back this up with some additional ranking, which was not just the sort of standard normalization, standardization and ranking. And so really what we've done to make a long story short is to define a graph with an adjacency matrix, and that leads you naturally to a number of rankings. But a couple that come out of that are, one is just the weighted average rank. And so what that means is that you work out the rank of each of the individuals, each of the universities, on a particular criterion, and then you average a university's rank across those criteria, weighted by whatever weights you think are appropriate. And of course, there's a skill to choosing those weights. Related to that is the power index, and the power index sort of not only takes into account your average rank, but it also takes into account the things that you dominate. But in fact, somewhat disappointingly, in all of the data that we've looked at, the power index doesn't provide much extra information above the weighted average rank. So here now are the drug harm data replotted, but now with this color scale, which gives their ranking. And so again, these at the top here, crack, alcohol, and heroin, come out near the top. And then tobacco, GHB, and butane, actually, you can see from the color, they are, in fact, probably less harmful on this weighted average rank. Here's the university data. I'm sure you can't read it, and that's probably good. But I'll show you, it's plotted in exactly the same way. There are 124 of them. If I had a nice interactive graphics, then I could mouse over things, but I haven't. And so here's a little, here's a close-up of a bit of it. Up at the top here, these are the dominating universities. Cambridge first on average rank, Imperial College, London School of Economics, Durham, University College, Oxford. So this sort of concurs, I think, probably with your intuition. And then Exeter is somewhere here in the next rank. Here it is, just at the top here, at rank 7 on this basis. And then there are other universities which I won't mention nearer the bottom. Okay. So this is a sort of unsatisfactory plot, I think, in many ways, because it doesn't tell me much about the sort of, I can't plot each of the universities or the drugs in some sort of spatial relationship. And so we've done a little bit of work to try and capture that. And the way that we've done that is to try and define a distance between universities or drugs, which is only based on the relationship of that drug to or university to the other drugs or universities. And this, I'm afraid I don't know of a very nice way of writing it, but really what this says is that if I think of another university and I want to compare, for example, Exeter and Plymouth, since we're picking on Plymouth in this talk, then let's take another university, for example, Aston. And if both Plymouth and Exeter are better on student satisfaction than Aston, then we score 1. If they're both worse, then we also score 1. But if they differ, then you don't get any score. And so now we can evaluate the similarity of Plymouth and Exeter based on their relation to this test university, Aston in this case. And then if I then average over all of the universities that I've got, then I can average out the effect of the test university. I can just try each one of the universities in turn, and that gives me a distance that we've called the dominance distance in between all of those universities. Once I've got the distance, well, it turns out it's a proper distance, it's a metric, and so I can then use metric multidimensional scaling to take those distances and find a set of coordinates which preserve the distances between the individuals. And of course that might have to happen in quite a large dimensional space, but essentially you're using principal component analysis to project it down into a couple of dimensions, and that's what I've done here. And so here is a visualization of, again, the nut drug harm data, where over here is crack, alcohol, and heroin in 2 dimensions, and then coming down to LSD and mushrooms, the least harmful things according to average rank, down at the other end. The colours are average rank. It's quite useful as well because I can also think about what would be the most harmful drug. I don't know what it is, but it would be the drug which dominates everything. Presumably some chemist is synthesizing it somewhere. But if we came up with that, here it is. That's where it would lie in this visualization. And the least harmful drug, the one which is dominated by absolutely everything, lies down here. And so I'd call these the zenith and nadir points. There's something taken from multi-objective optimization. And that then allows you another sort of ranking of the drugs or universities, if you were doing it for universities, which is essentially the distance from this zenith point up here. And as you can see, that would put crack, alcohol, and heroin near the top, and whereas LSD and mushrooms are a long way from that point. Here are the universities subjected to the same sort of visualization. Here's the zenith point. This is, I don't know, probably this is Stanford or Harvard, which would dominate everybody, including Cambridge. Here's Cambridge, and Exeter's here. And to avoid embarrassment, I haven't named any of the other ones, but I'll tell you who they are if you want to see them later. But I think what this does is give you a visualization which tells you the relationship of particular universities. So I can look at a couple of universities here and here, and what I ought to be able to do, of course, is mouse over this and look at the individual data afterwards. But it tells you that these 2 universities are similar in their relationships to all of the other data that we've got. Perhaps I'll skip over that. The last thing that I'll briefly talk about, am I all right for time? Couple minutes, okay, is that we can also look at the relationships between the criteria on which the data have been evaluated. And that can be done, again, by defining a distance between those criteria. And the distance, the natural distance, is Spearman's foot rule, which essentially finds it's the absolute distance between rankings. And using that distance, you can do the same sort of embedding and arrive at a plot of the distances, or a plot that preserves the distances between the criteria themselves. And so in a university context, it's perhaps somewhat surprising that student satisfaction is way over here compared with all these other criteria. Academic spending and research are quite close together, but facilities spend seems to have nothing to do with anything else. So this is just a way of visualizing those correlations between them. So here are some summaries. I ought to stop, but I'll leave you with this last plot, and this is from some older data, but this is a plot of the score that you would get using the standard ranking. It's from a few years ago. But also plotted on here are error bars, which result from a sensitivity analysis. And through various measures, we thought that there might be a 5%, something like that, error in each of the measurements of these criteria. And if you have a 5% error in each of the criteria, then that gives you error bars on your rankings for universities, which is about plus or minus 3 places. So if somebody tells you they're in the top 10, you might have heard that from a university near you, then they might be in the top 13, or they might be in the top 7. Okay, so thank you very much.